The air in the Paramount screening room was so thick with cigar smoke you could almost taste the nicotine on your tongue. It was 1971, and the room was filled with men who held the fate of Hollywood in their manicured hands. But on this particular Tuesday, there was no glamour in the darkness. There was only the smell of cold coffee, expensive leather, and impending violence. Robert Evans, the studio's legendary head of production, didn't just stand up, he erupted from his chair. He pointed a shaking finger at the silver screen, where the raw footage of the day was playing silently. "What is that?" Evans screamed, his voice cracking, echoing off the soundproof walls. "I asked for a gangster. I asked for a killer. And you bring me that?" On the screen, a young man was walking. He was short. He was pale. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes looked perpetually frightened. He didn't look like a movie star. He looked like someone you'd walk past in a subway station without a second glance. "That midget is ruining the picture," Evans continued, turning to the terrified junior executives huddled in the back. "He's anemic. He's weak. When is he going to shoot someone? When is he going to turn into a damn man?" The silence that followed was heavier than the insults. No one dared to speak. They knew the decision had already been made in the silence of Evans' mind. The project was already over budget, the mafia was threatening the production daily, and now the lead actor was a disaster. The order was given quietly, almost casually, as the lights in the screening room flickered back on. "Get rid of him. Get me Redford. Or get me anyone who doesn't look like a frightened rat." Miles away, in a cramped, damp trailer on a Harlem street corner, Al Pacino stared at his reflection in a dirty mirror. He didn't know the exact words that had been shouted in that screening room, but he could feel the vibrations. He could feel the target painted on his back. He adjusted his tie, his hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from a paralyzing realization. He wasn't Michael Corleone yet. He was just a kid from the Bronx who'd walked into a room he didn't belong in, and the walls were closing in. But what nobody in that screening room knew, what even Pacino didn't realize as he splashed cold water on his face to hide the tears, was that this weakness they hated was actually a weapon that was about to go off. To understand why this moment was so volatile, you have to reconstruct the atmosphere of the set. It wasn't the polished, respectful environment we imagine when we think of a masterpiece. It was a hostile territory. The crew despised him. It sounds impossible now, but in 1971, the camera operators, the grips, the lighting technicians, they were used to John Wayne. They were used to men who filled the doorframe. When Pacino walked onto the set, there was no hush of reverence. There were snickers. Imagine standing on a mark, trying to summon the emotion of a grieving son, while 3 feet away, 2 electricians are making bets on when you'll be fired. That was Pacino's reality. Fly-on-the-wall accounts from that set describe a brutal isolation. During lunch breaks, while James Caan was holding court and laughing with the crew, and Marlon Brando was eating alone in his trailer, Pacino would sit on an apple box in the corner, chewing a sandwich that tasted like cardboard. He could hear the whispers. "He's too short." He mumbled that last line. "I give him 2 more days." The sensory overload of the set was overwhelming. The heat of the arc lights was oppressive, making the wool suits itch and cling to the skin. The constant shouting of the assistant directors created a rhythm of chaos, and in the center of this storm stood Pacino, absorbing every ounce of this negative energy. He wasn't acting the part of the alienated brother. He was living it. The studio wanted him to be tough. They wanted him to burst into rooms and shout. But Pacino was doing something the camera hadn't learned to see yet. He was internalizing. He was taking all that hatred, all that dismissal, and packing it deep into his chest, compressing it like gunpowder. But gunpowder is useless without a spark, and the spark came in the form of a terrifying ultimatum. It was Francis Ford Coppola who delivered the news. The director was fighting his own war, trying to keep his job, but he knew he couldn't save Pacino much longer. The conversation happened in the shadows, away from the prying ears of the studio spies who infested the set. Coppola pulled Pacino aside. The director looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his shirt stained with sweat despite the cold New York air. "Al," Coppola whispered, his voice intense and desperate, "they want you gone." Pacino looked up. He didn't say anything. He just blinked, his large, dark eyes absorbing the blow. "I've bought you time," Coppola continued, gripping Pacino's shoulder, "but I can't hold them back anymore. We're shooting the restaurant scene tomorrow, the Salazzo hit. This is it, Al. You have to show them. You can't just be the quiet kid anymore. If you don't terrify them tomorrow, don't bother coming in on Friday." It wasn't a pep talk. It was a death sentence with a loophole. That night, Pacino didn't sleep. How could he? The script lay on his bedside table in his small apartment, the pages worn and stained with coffee. He read the scene over and over again. Michael stands up, Michael shoots, Michael leaves. It seemed so simple on paper, just physical action. But Pacino knew that if he just acted the motions, he was dead. He had to find something else. He had to find the moment where a soul breaks. He paced his room for hours. The sound of the city outside, sirens, honking cars, distant shouting, became the soundtrack of his anxiety. He wasn't thinking about box office numbers or Oscars. He was thinking about humiliation, the shame of being fired, the shame of proving everyone right, the shame of being the midget. As dawn broke over New York City, painting the sky a bruised purple, Pacino stopped pacing. He realized something. He didn't need to pretend to be a killer. He just needed to let the world see the rage he had been hiding under that polite, quiet surface. The location was a cramped Italian restaurant in the Bronx, Louis'. It was raining that day, a miserable, relentless drizzle that turned the city gray. When the cast and crew arrived, the mood was funereal. The rumors had spread. This is the kid's last stand. The space was tiny. Once the cameras, the lights, and the sound equipment were jammed inside, there was barely room to breathe. The air quickly became stale, smelling of garlic, old frying oil, damp wool, and nervous sweat. Pacino sat at the small table with the checkered tablecloth. Across from him sat two giants. Al Lettieri, playing Salazzo, looked like a predatory animal with his slicked-back hair and intense gaze. And Sterling Hayden, playing the corrupt Captain McCluskey. Hayden was a massive man, a legitimate Hollywood veteran. He took up space just by breathing. Pacino felt small. Physically, he was small compared to them. The camera angles emphasized this. He was the child at the grown-ups' table. The makeup artist came over to dab the sweat from Pacino's forehead. "You okay, honey?" she whispered. "You're shaking." She was right. Under the table, out of sight of the lens, Pacino's knee was bouncing uncontrollably. His hands were cold and clammy. This wasn't method acting. This was the physiological response to a threat. "Clear the set. We're going for a take," the assistant director shouted. The bell rang. Silence fell over the room. A suffocating, heavy silence. The only sound was the hum of the arc lights and the distant, muffled sound of the rain outside. Coppola stood by the camera. He didn't look at the script. He looked at Pacino. He was praying. The studio executives weren't there in person, but their presence was felt. They would be watching the dailies tomorrow morning. This reel of film was either going to be Pacino's breakout or his obituary. Roll sound. Sound speeds. Scene 112. Take 1. The clapperboard snapped shut like a gunshot. Action. The scene began quietly. Too quietly. Lettieri, Salazzo, started speaking in Italian. Rapid, aggressive, confident. Pacino sat there. He didn't move. He didn't react big. For the crew, watching in the shadows, this was confusing. They were used to actors who acted. They expected facial gymnastics. They expected tears or shouting. But Pacino was giving them nothing, or so it seemed. He was listening, but he wasn't just listening to the words. He was listening to the sound of his own fate closing in. His jaw muscles tightened. A small, almost invisible twitch appeared under his left eye. He looked down at the table, then up at Sollozzo. Then his eyes drifted away, scanning the room. This is the unseen angle. The script said Michael was looking for a way out, but in reality, Pacino was disassociating. The pressure was so immense that his mind had floated out of his body. Those glazed, shifting eyes that became legendary, that wasn't a choice. That was a man in shock. Sterling Hayden, McCluskey, continued eating. The sound of his fork scraping the china plate was excruciatingly loud in the dead silence of the set. Scrape, scrape. It sounded like a knife being sharpened. The cameraman, squinting through the viewfinder, felt a chill run down his spine. Through the lens, magnified and isolated, he saw what the naked eye couldn't. He saw the transformation. The scared midget was gone. In his place sat a coiled viper, waiting to strike. Pacino leaned back in his chair. The movement was slow, almost lazy, but it was the laziness of a predator who knows the prey isn't going anywhere. Suddenly, the air in the room changed. The electricians stopped chewing their gum. The script supervisors stopped taking notes. Everyone froze. They didn't know what was about to happen, but they knew the anemic kid was about to draw blood. In the movie, you hear the screeching sound of an elevated train growing louder and louder, building the tension until it snaps. But on the set, there was no train. There was only the hum of the lights and the terrifying sound of Pacino's breathing getting heavier. Michael asks to go to the bathroom. He walks out. He comes back. He sits down. Now the gun was in his pocket, a heavy, cold prop that felt like an anchor dragging him down. He didn't pull it out immediately. He waited. He let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable, until the studio executives watching the dailies would be screaming, "Do something!" at the screen. And then he stood up. It wasn't a heroic stand. It was jagged, clumsy, real. He pulled the gun. The blast was deafening in the small room. Bang! Sollozzo's head snapped back, the spray of fake blood misty in the hot lights. Bang! McCluskey took one in the throat, then the head. Sterling Hayden crashed onto the table, taking the tablecloth and the veal with him. The chaos was absolute. But watch Pacino. He didn't pose. He didn't look cool. He looked at the gun in his hand with genuine disgust. His lip curled. He looked like he wanted to vomit. He dropped the gun. It hit the floor with a hollow clatter. He turned and walked out of the frame. His shoulders hunched, his walk fast and erratic. Cut! The echo of the blanks died away. The smoke from the gun barrels hung in the air, creating a blue haze. Usually, the set explodes into noise after a big stunt. Reset. Check the blood. Makeup. But this time, silence. Francis Ford Coppola didn't yell, "Great job!" He couldn't speak. He just exhaled. A long, shaky breath that he seemed to have been holding since 1969. The crew looked at each other. The guys who had been making fun of Pacino an hour ago were now avoiding his gaze. Not out of disrespect, but out of fear. They had just seen a ghost enter a man's body. The footage was rushed to the lab, developed, printed. That night, the reel ran in the executive screening room. Robert Evans sat there, the same man who called him a midget, the same man who wanted Redford. The projector whirred, the scene played out, the fork scraping, the eyes rolling, the explosion of violence. When the lights came up, nobody moved. Evans stared at the blank screen for a long time. The smoke from his cigar rose in a straight line, undisturbed by any movement. Finally, he turned to his assistant. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit he was wrong. Men like that never do. He just said, quietly, "Cancel the slate for the other kid. Pacino stays." It wasn't a victory parade. It was a reprieve. The execution order was lifted, not because they liked him, but because they couldn't take their eyes off him. The war was won, but the soldier was broken. While the executives were celebrating the dailies with scotch, Pacino was miles away, facing the hardest part of the night, the silence after the noise. Al Pacino returned to his small apartment that night. He didn't feel like a movie star. He felt like he had been in a car accident. His ears were still ringing from the gunshots. The smell of the cordite was stuck in his hair. He went to the bathroom sink and washed his face. The water was cold. He looked up at the mirror. The eyes staring back at him were still wide, still haunted. It would take hours for Michael Corleone to leave the building, and for Al to return. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall. There was no entourage, no fans screaming his name, just a young actor in a lonely room in New York, wondering if he had enough energy to do it all again tomorrow. He had saved his career. He had changed the course of cinema history. He had ensured that decades later, people would wear t-shirts with his face on them. But in that moment, he was just a guy who was glad he didn't have to go back to being a bike messenger. He turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room. The legend began there, not in the spotlight, but in the dark. What Al Pacino did that day wasn't just acting. It was survival. He took the fear of losing everything and turned it into the most dangerous weapon Hollywood had ever seen. But he wasn't the only one pushing the limits of sanity on a set. If you think this story was intense, wait until you hear about what happened to Shelley Duvall inside the walls of the Overlook Hotel with Stanley Kubrick. That wasn't a movie set. It was a psychological experiment. If you want to step into that room, make sure you're subscribed, because the Rumor Report never sleeps, and neither does the truth.